Chapter 64. Fear searched the Cenarian army in the dusk, looking for Solon or Dorian. Neither man could be found. When he asked why the garrison at Screaming Winds wasn't here, a count named Rinbald Drake told him of the massacre and shared a worry. If Callie had slaughtered veterans, what would happen if they brought her here? Desperate, Fear rode on. He was carrying the only possible salvation for the entire ignorant army. To make matters worse, he was no seer, at least not in any useful sense. He could see weaves of magic that were close, as if through a Ladacian enlarging glass. But if you put a man even as talented as Solon 50 paces away, Fear couldn't see so much as a flicker. After frenzied inquiries, he'd found two mages, a husband and wife, neither very talented, but both healers. They said they'd seen no great talents in the entire army, but then Trevor Nile had gazed around hopelessly and stopped. "Drissa," he said. She came and took his hand. Both of them fixed their attention on a foothill a few hundred paces from the army. "Lend us your power, and we'll lend you our sight," Drissa told Fear. He'd done it, feeling queasy to surrender himself while carrying Kurach, and then the foothill was ablaze in light. The men were too far away for Fear to recognize faces, and they'd taken care not to skyline themselves, but each man's talent blazed, as individual as the patterns of his irises. Fear knew that those men, had rubbed shoulders and locked horns with them. They were 6 of Shosendi's most powerful magi. Fear knew what they'd come for. No doubt the bastards actually believed Kurach belonged to them. But they could wield the sword. He couldn't. If he took Kurach to them and swore to surrender it conditionally, any one of those men could incinerate the entire Caledonian army. Fear didn't have Solon's silver tongue, but with Kurach in hand, his laden tongue might do just fine. So he rode pell-mell for the brothers on a horse he borrowed from the Niles, praying that he could get to them before the armies closed ranks. If he reached them in time, Cenaria might win without losing a man. The path took him into a ravine out of the sight of the Magi, and there he'd promptly run into Caledonian outriders. His horse had been killed by an archer, and then the lancers had come for him, disdaining arrows for the sport of killing a man on foot. Now 3 of them were dead, and Fear had bigger problems. Behind the Caledonians, unbelievably, were Sisera. So as he fought the last horseman, he tried to move into the Magi's line of sight. Gods, they were barely 100 paces away. If they saw Fear, not even 1,000 Sisera would be able to stand between those 6 Magi and Kurach. The Sisera wouldn't let Fear break their ranks. They were too disciplined. What they would do was judge him by how he fought, and Sisera had very particular notions about how one should fight. The way of the sword had peculiar notions about fighting. It entailed assuming every time you went into battle that you would die, and disdaining death so long as you died honorably. The ultimate way to strike an enemy was to strike him in the fraction of a second before he landed a killing blow. To Fear's way of thinking, that was fine and practical when the margins were slim, as they were between the best fighters. If you cared too much about getting hurt, you'd never brave the damage you'd need to take to kill the best. That would make you flinch. If you flinched, you'd die, and worse, to the Syrian mind, you'd lose. Killing 3 horsemen was no mean feat. A veteran horseman was worth 10 footmen. But a mage on foot wasn't just a footman, and Fear had no compunction about using magic to help slay the first 3. He knew he could kill the last Caledonian bearing down on him, but the how of it eluded him. What impression did he want to leave with those sword lords? To a Syrian, combat was communication. A man might deceive with his words, but his body spoke true. Fear sheathed Kurach, that was another problem he'd think about later, and ran toward the horseman on the lance side. In battle, the man would be content to let his mountain pony run Fear down, but now Fear was sure the man would try to kill him personally, and there. The man leaned out to the side and leveled his 10-foot ash pole. Fear leapt into the air. It was no great leap, but the Caledonian was riding a 12-hand mountain pony rather than some hulking 18-hand Alitarian Dysterior. Fear's flying sidekick took him over the lance, and his foot caught the Caledonian's face. Fear realized 2 things at the point of impact. First, the Syrian villagers who'd devised a kick to unseat horsemen probably didn't try it when the horse was galloping. Second, something popped, and it wasn't the Caledonian's neck. He crashed to the ground. When he stood, his ankles screamed, and black spots swam in front of his eyes. But there was no revealing his weakness, not in front of Ciceri. Even as he stood, they closed the circle. One of them checked the Caledonian, with a knife drawn to dispatch him, but he was already dead. Fear stood in haughty silence, meat-slab arms folded, but his heart was cold. There was one more bend of solid rock between him and the magi on the hill. If he could move 10 paces and draw in his talent, they would see him despite the trees. But he couldn't move 10 paces. He couldn't move 5. Outside the circle of drawn swords and notched arrows, a man was checking each of the corpses. Everywhere through his hair were the bound forelocks of his dead opponents. Most were bound at both ends. Ciceri he'd killed, but others were bound only to his hair, foreigners. The circle of iron parted, and Lentano Garwashi looked up at Fear. You stand as tall and fight as well as a Nephilim, yet you didn't even bloody your sword with these dogs. Who are you, giant? Lentano Garwashi asked. A Nephilim? Fear racked his brain for everything he knew about Sira. Thank the gods, it was a fair amount. Most sword masters learned a lot about Sira, since not a few of their trainers were exiled Syrians who had served on the wrong side of one or another of their incessant wars. But a Nephilim? The way of the sword. The first men crafted from iron? The soul of a man in his sword. I can't fight. I'm lame. Lantana Garwashi saw me fight, and now he'll want to prove he's bigger than this giant. That was it. These were the heroes and the great men of old. The Nephilim were the children born of mortal women to the sons of the gods. Or was it the god? Hell, he couldn't remember if Syrians were polytheists. Well, he'd just have to be religiously obscure. Be not afraid, Fear said. He saw consternation ripple across those iron faces. Who told Lantano Garwashi not to be afraid? Fear figured that if he was going to bluff, he might as well play it to the hilt. Speaking of hilts, now might be the time for Kurach to do its trick. Part of Kurach's latent magic was that it would become any shape of sword its owner wished. Parts of it never changed, but enough of it to help Fear take on his suddenly conceived role of divine messenger. He'd read descriptions of a Syrian sword that ought to do nicely, as he willed Kurach to take the right shape. Is that all I have to do? He drew the sword slowly and kept his eyes on Lantano Garwashi's until the man looked down. Around the circle, eyes were widening, men were gasping, jaws were dropping. Among these, Lantano Garwashi's elite. Fear followed their eyes. Kurach not only understood the type of sword Fear wanted it to emulate, it had known the very sword itself. Fear had imagined that a sword with the fire of heaven along the blade mean either the patterns of exquisite steel or an engraving of fire. Another translation was with the fire of heaven in the blade. Kurach had taken the latter approach. Twin dragons, Fear didn't have to look to know that they would be twins, each subtly different, were engraved on either side of the blade, near the hilt. Each was breathing fire toward the tip of the blade. But it wasn't an etching of fire, it was fire inside the sword. Where the fire burned, and for several inches past it, the sword blade became as transparent as glass. It was as if Fear were holding a bar of flame. The sword stayed a constant length, but fires within grew and shrank, depending on... Fear didn't know what it depended on, but right now the dragons blazed out fire all the way to the tip of the sword, 3.5 feet from the hilt, and then the fire died down. Fear had been looking to impress, but the looks on the Caesarians' faces were closer to worship. He was barely able to wipe the amazement off his own face before eyes began turning back to him. Lantana Garwashi looked as if he'd just been stabbed with fear for the first time in his life. Then it was gone, and out of all the men, only he looked angry. Why does a Nephilim bear Cirsaletes, the blade of heaven? Fear had a sudden suspicion that Kurach had become that particular blade too easily. It was like it had known what it should look like. What if it isn't pretending to be the blade of heaven? What if it is it? I didn't make an impressive blade. I made the most holy artifact these people know. How do I go limping away now? It didn't matter. It was too late to stop. I am a mere servant. I bear a message for you, Lantana Garwashi, should you be necessary enough to accept it. Fear laced his voice with magic, altered it, added resonance and depth befitting the voice of heaven. This path lies before you. Fight Kalidor and become a great king. Not the greatest message for a god, but short enough that Fear's lack of eloquence might not shine through. With the added tones and volume, he thought it respectably awe-inspiring. But Garwashi didn't look odd. He drew his sword slowly. It hung from his grip, limp and dull. Fear saw his mistake too late. Why had he held out that particular prize? He'd told Garwashi he would be king, but to be a son of a commoner, it was an impossibility. Garwashi's sword was plain iron, a battered, sad thing he held with fierce pride because it was such a deep shame to him. An iron sword would never rule. There was no trading swords. A Caesari's soul was his sword. To Syrians, that wasn't an abstraction, it was fact. That sharp, sad length of iron gave stark testament of Fear's lie. Garwashi's grip tightened on his soul, and the tip of the blade lifted in defiance. Around the circle, the Caesari still held their weapons, but the bows were no longer drawn, and the swords had been forgotten. The Caesari looked as if this moment was being etched forever into their minds. Their war master, the greatest Caesari of all time, facing a Nephilim bearing a sword out of legends. And their Lantana Garwashi showed not a shred of fear. If I am Caesari enough? Lantana Garwashi asked. I will die before I accept mockery, even the mockery of the gods. I am Caesari enough to die by the sword of heaven, or I will be Caesari enough to kill the god's messenger. Then he attacked with a speed that had made Lantana Garwashi legend. Fear couldn't fight. Fighting this man with only one good leg was suicide. Fear blocked Garwashi's first attack and then reached out with magic and yanked the man toward him. The Siren flew into him and the men pressed against each other, swords crossed, faces inches apart. Kurach and the blade of heavens, whichever it was, flared to life. The dragons breathed fire out the tip of the blade. Fear's only thought was that his arms had to be stronger than Garwashi's. If the man stood at a distance, he'd murder Fear, but in close to Fear's massive arms, Fear had a chance. But before either of the men could do anything, light began to bloom in a second bar between the two men. It must have taken only a second, but for that second it seemed both men's martial training abandoned them. They each stood merely straining to throw the other off balance, each trying to ignore what each wanted so desperately to look at. Fear hadn't done anything. Maybe Kurach was reacting to the magic he had used to pull Garwashi to him. Garwashi's sword went red and then white. It burned brighter than Kurach, and then, as the men pushed against each other, Garwashi's sword exploded. As explosions go, it was gentle but implacable. No burning fragments of sword tore through Fear's flesh, but there was no stopping the force either. He was flipped head over heels backward and landed face down, a good 15 feet away. He tried to stand, but the pain in his ankle stabbed through him so fiercely that he knew he would black out if he did. He stayed on his knees. He stared up the hill and took in as much power as he could hold. Look, damn you, Lucas, look! He was still hidden by the trees, but if one of the seers just looked, they would see him. 30 feet away, Lantana Garwashi rose to his feet. Impossibly, he was holding his sword. No, not his sword. His sword has vanished, disappeared. There weren't even smoldering fragments of it left. With a look of absolute wonder in his eyes, he held the blade of heavens, and it looked perfect, as if Lantana Garwashi had been born for that sword, and the sword made 1,000 years ago with Lantana Garwashi in mind. If the Caesari had been astonished before, now they were stricken dumb. They dropped to their knees, even as Fear was. One of them said, "The gods have given Lantana Garwashi a new sword." He meant that the gods had given Lantana Garwashi a new soul, a legend's soul, a king's soul. In every eye, Fear saw that the men approved. They had known it. They had served Lantano before he had become the Lantana Garwashi, King Lantano, before he had defied and humbled a Nephilim. Now Fear was on his knees, unable to stand. Lantano's eyes were aflame with destiny as he looked down on the giant. "Indeed, it is as the gods foresaw. The blade of heavens is yours," Fear said. What else could he say? Lantano touched the blade to Fear's chin. Nephilim, messenger and servant of the gods. You have the face of an Alitarian, but you fight and speak as only a Cesari can. I would have you serve me, his eyes said, or you can die. Fear needed no Nephilim from the gods to tell him his destiny. He glanced up the hill, and no help came. He wasn't surprised. He already was what he would forever be, the small man who served great men. He would forever be the man who lost courage. He lowered his head, defeated. I will serve.